Hello everyone, my name is Rose Drew. I'm CEO of Interfaith Glasgow. A very warm welcome on behalf of Interfaith Glasgow to the final event in our series Voices from the Portal, Reimagining Our Post-Pandemic World, a series which has been running monthly now since September. Thank you so much for being with us today or this evening, whichever it is for you. For those of you who don't know Interfaith Glasgow, we're a Scottish charity that promotes and facilitates friendship building, dialogue and cooperation between people from diverse religion and belief backgrounds. Now, prior to the pandemic, mostly our work was within Glasgow, but it's been a huge silver lining of having no choice but to work online, that we've been able to connect with people all over the world and to learn from a variety of different local contexts, something that's felt particularly valuable during the pandemic when many of the problems with which we're grappling are shared across the globe. Tonight is a fantastic example of this. What a pleasure to be welcoming friends, not just from Glasgow and elsewhere in the UK, but also from the USA, South Africa and beyond. Now, so that you can see where people are based, perhaps you could rename yourself to display your country just after your name, and maybe also pop into the chat where you're joining us from today. And wherever you are, thank you for being here. You are very welcome. The Voices from the Portal series has been inviting people of all backgrounds to come together to reflect on some of the key issues highlighted by the pandemic, to consider what we've learned, what opportunities have emerged, and what changes we want to see in relation to issues ranging from poverty, racism, and the cultivation of kindness, to the climate crisis, mental health, and today, religious practice. Our aim has been to create contexts for conversations in which a variety of religion and belief perspectives can be heard, and where people can engage intentionally and deeply across religious and cultural boundaries to address critical issues that have a bearing on the future for us all. Although we're, alas, still very much in the grip of this pandemic, there will be light at the end of the tunnel, and we can still think about the kind of world into which we wish to emerge and how we might help shape it. Now, if you've missed previous events in the series, don't worry. Our intention is to produce a series of 6 short shareable films using edited Zoom footage from each of the events, covering some of the main insights from the speakers. So do look out for those on Interfaith Glasgow's social media channels, hopefully towards the end of next month. At the start of all previous events in this series, I've quoted the words of Indian writer Arundhati Roy that inspired the series title, Voices from the Portal. Let's hear them again one last time. She writes, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." So here we are again today with the final opportunity in this series to imagine our world anew and to listen to each other's ideas about how we might bring that world into being. This event was intentionally scheduled to take place during World Interfaith Harmony Week, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be delivering it in partnership with international partners, the Interfaith Center of New York and Cape Town Interfaith Initiative. The Interfaith Center of New York, or ICNY, who we also worked with on last month's event on mental health, is a non-profit organization that works to overcome prejudice, violence, and misunderstanding through engagement with New York City's grassroots religious and civic leaders and their communities. Cape Town Interfaith Initiative, also a non-profit organization, is the coordinating body for the interfaith movement in the Western Cape. Its motivating vision is of a South Africa unified by interreligious and spiritual understanding and respect. On behalf of Interfaith Glasgow, thank you so much ICNY and Cape Town Interfaith Initiative for working with us to devise and deliver today's programme. I'm very much looking forward to seeing it unfold. So our focus today is religious practice and the changes necessitated by social distancing. The inability to be able to meet in person has led to all sorts of innovations, most noticeably in the emergence of various forms of online religious observance. We'll be asking, what has been learned through this process that might help us once social distancing is no longer necessary? What have we most missed about the ability to practice our religions in each other's physical presence? Perhaps we've become aware of gaps we didn't know existed until recent innovations filled them. Might some new practices stand the test of time? What will the new normal look like? Before we get down to thinking about these meaty questions, Interfaith Glasgow's Development Director, Dr. Magdalene Lamkin, will tell you a little about the practicalities of how today's programme will run before handing over to our first speaker, who will help frame our discussions. Over to you, Magdalene.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you to everyone for being here. So to kick off our discussion today and to help frame that discussion, our first speaker joins us from Manchester Metropolitan University. Dr. Joshua Edelman is Senior Lecturer at Manchester School of Theatre and Principal Investigator for the British Ritual Innovation under COVID-19, or BRIC-19 research project. With assistance from research partners, including our friends at Interfaith Scotland, the Council of Christians and Jews, and the Faith and Belief Forum, the BRIC-19 project has been studying how British religious communities have adapted to the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions that it has imposed, with the aim of making sense of the new ways that religious communities are coming together and using those findings to help make religious communities stronger and more resilient in the future. Josh, thank you for being here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Magdalene, for that wonderful introduction. It's very kind of you. I am going to, I should say it's a real pleasure to be here and to get a chance to talk about this. I am going to try to share my screen now, which worked a moment ago, but you never know with these things. Can I just ask if folks can see the first slide? I'll take that as a yes. I'm seeing thumbs up. All is good. So again, thank you for having me, and I should say thank you for having us. I feel like I'm speaking on behalf of the whole BRIC-19 team. The BRIC-19 project really is British specific. It's funded by the British government, and is looking at the ways that religious communities have adapted, changed, innovated their ritual practice or not during this time, and the effects that those adaptations have had. Even saying that has become difficult. The word adaptation is one word that we've started to use a lot more than innovation, which is what the I in the BRIC stands for, because for some people, the term innovation has an extremely negative connotation. The idea that what you are doing is something different than what was done before is a problem for many people. These are some of the sensitivities we're trying to negotiate. The project is relatively new. It's only been going for a few months, which might seem like ages in COVID time, but in academic time is almost nothing. So actually I have a chance today to share with you some of the first findings of our report. Most of what I'm going to talk about comes from a large-scale survey of both congregants and ritual makers across the UK of all traditions. I have to say we thanks very much to Interfaith Glasgow and Interfaith Scotland and Marine Seer in particular. We've had an extremely large take-up of the survey from Scotland, and we're working on a case study based in Glasgow, which is going to be very, very exciting. The survey was of both ritual leaders and participants in rituals, congregants. And most of what I'm going to share with you today is not specific to any one religion. Might sound a bit odd. And of course, we're very aware that different communities, different religious communities and different geographic communities have responded very differently to this situation. However, in the limited time that I had, I thought it would be more useful to show you some general patterns that we're seeing. The survey is going to be supplemented by about 15 or so, more than we thought, because it was so useful, individual case studies of particular communities, particular events, particular ways in which communities of all sorts, including things like funeral homes, chaplaincies in prisons, the National Memorial for COVID-19 victims that's been organized by St. Paul's Cathedral in London, have tried to do this work. That is going to fill out the results of the survey. Unfortunately, we've just started that work now, and I don't have that much results I don't have kind of official results from that to share with you yet, but I have had many conversations with the people who are doing those case studies, including myself, the other members of the team who you see here, and what I'm saying today is informed by that. I should just, you see there our website and our Twitter and all that sort of thing. Please do get in touch if you want more information, and we're regularly posting research updates on our website. One of the first things that jumps out is the importance of continuity, and this odd situation that things are happening almost entirely differently, but it is very important that they are very much the same. Let me explain these graphs. The ones on top, the top left, ritual transformation, we asked people, we asked leaders if the regular rituals, that is the weekly or monthly or daily rituals that their community is conducting, are they done in the same manner as they were before? And you'll see almost everybody said they were quite different. A full 53% said they were very different, and another 12% said they were almost entirely different. Only 6% said they were almost the same, and essentially no one said they were exactly the same. So very clearly, everyone is saying we are conducting rituals in a different manner. And yet, those same people, if I asked, would you consider them to be the same rituals? Most people, with the plurality of people, 43% of leaders said they were almost entirely the same, and about the same number said they were slightly different, and essentially no one said they were very different. So one of the things, this pattern that we're seeing very much, is that ritual leaders and congregants are aware that things are being done differently, but the sense of continuity, the sense that these are the same things that have been done before, has been hugely important. And in our interviews and in the free text comments on the survey, we definitely see this, the idea that one of the things that ritual can do in a pandemic is a sense of continuity, is a sense of the marking of time. And I think all of us have had the sense that what time is has started to get very strange. To shape our lives, to give a regular clock to it, and to remind us of things that are truly important, including the divine, including God, including community, however this is phrased in different traditions. That sense of continuity is hugely important, which is part of why I think the resistance to the term innovation. The chart on the bottom, when we asked lay ritual participants, as in non-clergy, are the rituals that you've been participating in the same, even if they're conducted differently? The majority say yes, and very, very few say no, they're not the same. So it's not just that clergy intend them to be the same, they're being received as such, which is very odd. I think if you had asked, a year and a half ago, would you consider participating in a communal worship service online to be the same thing? Most people would say, well, of course not. It's important to mark how far we've gotten. Some of the major themes, though, that we're seeing, even though that this consistency is there are important differences that you can see very, not that far below the surface. One is actually frequency, and this might go in a direction that you don't expect. If anything, online rituals tend to be more frequent than they were beforehand. Quite a lot of churches in particular, but also other religious communities, Muslim and Jewish communities, are having online daily prayers that they never would have before, or there simply wasn't an interest in having a daily prayer before, and now that is something that quite a large number of people are attending. Very few congregations report that they are conducting regular rituals less frequently. Most are reporting either the same amount of frequency or a higher level of frequency. And certainly in the UK, and I'm not entirely sure this is the case in the US, I've seen some data there that actually suggests that it's not, the amount of attendance that most religious communities are seeing in the UK has gone way up. It's an order of magnitude larger than they were seeing before. Twice as much, 3 times, 4 times as many. Now, the quality of that engagement is an open question. One of the things about it is that there is this situation where the engagement seems to be shallower. It seems to be more spectatorial. More people are being reached and different people, but the connection in our survey seems to be less meaningful, less emotionally compelling. The services are often shorter. People talk about watching the service rather than being a part of it. And this is something that ritual leaders are aware of. And so some communities are doing things like using film, photography, letters sent in the post, the telephone, as a means of trying to overcome that, to create a sense of being more personal. You heard in my really generous introduction that my background is in theater studies. And this is part of why I come to this, because I think the techniques that actors have used for a long time of feeling a connection, whether from the stage to the seats or across a screen, are the sorts of techniques that clergy might want to start using and are, without any prompting from me or anybody else from the theater world, starting to use in order to make that happen. There's also very much a question of digital inclusion and exclusion. Many people are find this very accessible. Quite a lot of people who couldn't get into houses of worship before are now can, especially people in the disabled community, are finding this extremely welcoming and generous. On the other hand, there is digital poverty, and it really is a thing. The two groups that seem to be most susceptible to digital poverty for different reasons are the elderly and very small children. Now, there are some really interesting things about essentially making what frankly looks a bit like children's television as a means of having a children's accessible service for the under 5 set. But that group and the elderly are particularly hard to reach. Those who live in places without a great deal of internet connectivity are also an issue. To be honest, that hasn't come up so much in the UK, I think because compared to, say, the US, internet connectivity is fairly good here. One of the things that's also happened is lay empowerment. A lot more people are taking responsibility for their own ritual experience, whether or not there is the sense that the form of that experience is still the traditional form as dictated. Lay people, parishioners, congregants are taking on the responsibility of making sure that their own prayer practices are appropriate, are fit for purpose. One of the forms that's taking, which is really interesting, is the idea of ritual spaces in a domestic context. And I don't mean here the kind of home shrines that were traditional in some religious traditions. I'm talking about carving out a space for communal worship, often centered around a television or a computer, within the home that is a designated sacred space for traditions where that normal sacred space would usually be somewhere else, would usually be a public building or a communal building. That's really interesting. And we didn't quite expect the extent to which this is the case. And we're starting to try to collect photographs and stories of, how do you have the prayer corner in your home? And other people are doing this outside in their gardens, a little less in the English winter, I have to say, but trying to find an appropriate space for prayer. And it's interesting because that is not quite, we think of it as a domestic context, but it's a remarkably public space because other people are seen there, can see it, and they are seen there. It is actually a gathering place within the home. And that's really interesting, something we really want to think about. That connects to the sense that, you're making your own space. You're not necessarily making your own ritual, but you're making your own space and you're responsible for your engagement with that ritual, whether it's thin or thick, in a way that perhaps you weren't before. And there is the question also of training up. I think for both lay people and for professionals, the skills required to engage in ritual, especially online, are not necessarily the ones that they've built up over their lifetimes or their careers. And the learning curve has been very steep, but people have embraced it. And I think this is one of the reasons why the vast majority of people in our survey say we are not going to be able to go back to worship the way we did beforehand. The idea that lay people have a sense of ownership in their ritual lives, and that if they don't like the ritual life of their local congregation, they can simply go shopping effectively, and try another community that is geographically far away, but spiritually feels very close, that is a reality, I think, that religious leaders of all stripes are going to have to deal with after this, in a way that if you just went to your local church because it was your local church, that's not going to be the case anymore. For minority traditions, where geographic spread is a particular issue, where you might not have a large community in your area, this has been a real boon. This has enabled things, this has enabled connections and enabled a kind of blossoming of religious life, especially for minorities in rural areas. But I think the long-term effects of that are something that religious leaders are thinking about and will need to think about. So there is far more to say, but my time is limited, and I really want to mostly spend the time today listening to what the panel has to say. If you are interested, please obviously get in touch, and I will be around and happy to ask questions. Thank you very much for your attention, and as I said, it's an honor to be here.
Thank you so much, Josh. What a great insight into what has been happening in the UK, and it'll be really interesting to hear what is happening in the US and in Cape Town in South Africa. We don't have time to take any questions from the floor just now, I don't think, but you might be willing, if people wanted to ask you a question in the chat, Josh, seeing as you're very kindly sticking around, if people wanted to put any questions in the chat, perhaps you'd be willing to do that?
Yes, of course.
And I will now...
And I'm sorry I ran longer than I thought. I didn't actually see your message, Magdalene, sorry.
No problem at all. It's a tall order when we ask speakers to keep to time, and I'm so grateful for all that you've said, and it's been a great introduction. But now I am looking forward to handing over to Henry. Henry works for the Interfaith Center of New York, and he is going to be introducing our speakers. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Magdalene. And again, it's kind of amazing, this kind of like passing the baton back and forth between Glasgow, New York, and Cape Town. Talk about the kind of silver linings of life on Zoom. As much as I'm eager to get, in-person community building, it's just been a huge pleasure to work with my colleagues in Glasgow and Cape Town, and to be here with all of you transnationally this afternoon or this evening, depending where you are. Anyway, so I want to very briefly introduce our four faith leader panelists for the next phase of our conversation. And I think one of my colleagues in Glasgow is going to start highlighting folks. First, let me just say I'm not going to take the time right now to kind of recite everyone's extraordinary biographies and all their accomplishments. I'm putting a link in the chat right now. Oh, actually, there's two links in the chat. I think both of these links in the chat are both to a handout with written bios for our panelists. So if you'd like to learn a little more about their background and their work, please consult those bios. But for now, I'll just say I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Ntando Hadebe, who is a lay Catholic theologian and senior lecturer at St. Augustine College in Johannesburg. Hello, Dr. Hadebe. By Roshi Enkyo O'Hara, who is a Buddhist teacher and community leader here in New York, and Abbot of the village Zendo in Lower Manhattan. I think, can we also, there we go. Imam Dr. Rashied Omar, or Abdul Omar, who is wears two hats, academic and community-based, is a research scholar at the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. And I don't know how he finds the time, but he's also the Imam of the Claremont Main Road Mosque in Cape Town. Imam Dr. Omar, welcome. And finally, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, excuse me, who's a Jewish community leader, chaplain, a prominent contributor to civic life here in New York, and executive vice president of the New York Board of Rabbis. So it's been my pleasure to work with Rabbi Joe and Roshi Enkyo before. Dr. Hadebe, Imam Dr. Omar, nice to meet you, at least on my Zoom screen. I want to just turn things over to you guys as soon as possible, but just one more quick note about our panelists' kind of faith backgrounds and perspectives. I am delighted that we have with us on the panel Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist perspectives on the issues that we're exploring. But I think it's essential to remember that none of our panelists speaks on behalf of their entire faith tradition. No one, and this is with all due respect to our panelists who are wonderful, but no one speaks on behalf of an entire faith tradition. There is so much diversity within every faith community, within every faith tradition. So it's important to remember that what we have with us today is a Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist perspective on the future of religion following the COVID pandemic. But certainly not the singular Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or Buddhist perspective on these issues. So with no further ado, let me turn things over to our panelists. And I think just going alphabetically, Dr. Hadebe, can I ask you to speak first? And we're asking everyone to really speak briefly for just 4 or 5 minutes. To give us an overview from your community, and then we'll have time for a more open conversation quite soon. Okay, Dr. Hadebe, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, speaker and everyone. So I will speak, as you quite rightly said, there's no ways that one can speak for the whole community. So I speak not only as a theologian and a lay Catholic woman theologian, but also as a COVID-19 survivor. I was infected with COVID, so I will permeate what I'm about to say with my own experience because it plays an important role in this. I just have 3 points that I want to highlight. And I think the first one is the shock I think we all received when in the beginning of the shutdown, we were told that religion was a non-essential service. And I think for many it was, for many in the church, it was a shock. And yet when we gathered and started to process that definition as a non-essential service, we realized, with fellow theologians, that we had become so absorbed in our internal affairs, in a lot of doctrinal issues, that we were missing in action in terms of community involvement. And so that really struck a chord. During the struggles for justice, religion was at the center of life, and interfaith, all the faiths came together to serve the community. And now to be judged as a non-essential service was a wake-up call to say that we need to redefine our role in society to ensure that we are engaged in all spheres, so that we take the role as an essential role player in everything. And then secondly, I think it was mentioned in the first presentation, the whole empowerment of the laity, the need to democratize churches so that they are not centered around the clergy, because COVID-19 shut down, left many lay people feeling as if they've been thrown in the deep end because there was insufficient commitment to the formation, education, empowerment of lay people so that, they can function in any situation. So this is really another wake-up call to ensure that the lay people are as knowledgeable as the clergy, and that we decenter, democratize our religious spaces, particularly the inclusion of women, who are a majority of those that are in churches. And then the other one is that COVID-19 revealed that it is an epidemic of inequality. Even the simplest practice like social distance is not possible for over 50% of the population that live in informal settlements, crowded dwellings, insufficient sanitation, water supply. And the danger here is that the shift always, and we saw it in HIV and AIDS, that when the social issues of injustice and inequality, the shift becomes the medicalization. So the focus right now is on the vaccine, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what about the social injustice and inequality? We saw the same thing with HIV and AIDS, that once the ARVs came, the social issues were just swept under the carpet, and we find ourselves in the same place. And where is the religious voice maintaining that commitment to justice? And that really is something that we need to pay attention to. And then I want to speak as a COVID survivor and to say that one of the things that I encountered was there wasn't enough structures built by religious communities so that I could say, I know where to go as soon as I was tested COVID positive. I didn't know really where to go. I mean, I could, no support groups. We were unprepared. And even in the process, we could not mobilize ourselves to ensure that we've got structures that are functioning. For people that are losing loved ones, where are the mourning rituals? Where are the support structures, the counseling services? And so we are finding ourselves caught, as churches, that we have been absorbed in our own business and debates and not responding adequately to the needs of our communities, particularly social justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hadebe. And I appreciate everyone sticking to time limits, which is awesome, to make more space for conversation later. Let me next, again, just kind of going alphabetically, but it works out quite well that we're also going back and forth between South Africa and the US. Let me next bring on Roshi Enkyo O'Hara from the village Zendo. Roshi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Hadebe, for your remarks. My response mainly is to the points that Josh made. I felt very much in alignment with his findings. I'm the abbot of a small group of Zen students in Manhattan. We practice in a loft center. And what we've done is essentially very quickly move to all online meditations every morning, every evening, special programs on Saturdays and Sundays, all day meditation periods, and our ritual services. We've had, unfortunately, one funeral service and one memorial service. But there's several things that are interesting that happened. First of all, of course, I think what I'm hearing everyone experienced was that our community grew in such a shocking way. It was just amazing. I mean, usually I have a dozen people in the morning. I go over there every morning. Now we've got 60 people sitting with us in the mornings, over 100 in the evenings, and they're from all over the world. And so that's a very different kind of experience. Of course, as a kind of ordained Zen priest, I miss incense, I miss bodies, I miss my vestments, I miss my services, I miss my bowing. We have let go of a lot of aspects of practice that kind of embody the teachings, which are in the words and mind. But they're the embodiments, the ritual embodiments, we really have just decided not to do. And I have to give credit to, there's also been a shift in the power structure, you could say, in the sense that those of us who are Zen teachers, we've got 3 Roshis and 2 senseis and some, but the people that really made the change immediately were the younger members of our Sangha. They're the ones that took the reins and organized our online systems. And their advice, we really listen to. Things like shorten the chants. So, in Zen, we chant things 3 times, just in case we don't get it the first time, we don't get it the second time, we have to do it the 3rd time. But we cut back to chanting just 1 time through all of the verses. And I wouldn't be surprised is when we get back that we may, that'll come up again. Do we want to revert to the ancient tradition of chanting everything 3 times, or will we be happy to move on in kind of New York way with the one time through? So, the other thing is in our tradition, we have one-on-one meetings with the students, with the Zen students, to work with koans and work with sutra study. And that always happened because somebody actually physically took the energy and effort to go to the Zendo, and then they would speak to me. Now I'm speaking to people from all over the country who have a very different kind of background. They haven't been listening to the talks, they haven't been taking the classes. So it's a broader, less educated in the Zen way kinds of group that I'm working with. And yet I still feel, in the mornings when I just go into this private interview space and people line up and I bring them in one at a time, just as I would at the Zendo, it feels very much in parallel. So I mentioned the services, so in the future, we're already talking about how can we continue to have so many people partaking and joining in with us. And so we're considering some kind of hybrid system where we can begin to again have physical presence with our people, but also maybe a screen so that people from all over will join, and we'll see. Maybe people become more busy when life resumes after the pandemic. It's really not clear. One major issue for a community in New York City is finances. And again, we're quite surprised. We dropped our rates and we said, please, this is what the rate would be, and you pay what you can. And with that, along with the donations and not having residential retreats, we are still at the same level of money coming in as we were before. We're not above, but we're just maintaining. So we're able to pay this ridiculous rent we pay in Soho, and at the same time, keep our community together. So what will last? I love Josh's questions, and I'm going to have to make a contact with him because so I want to follow along what happens in other places. But there will be hybrid systems. And what have we learned? Have we learned that shortened ritual practices are a good idea or not? I mean, this is something we'll all have to look at. And so thank you. And I'll just listen to the others and come back with any questions I have.
Thank you, Roshi. Much appreciated. And again, for all of our panelists, we'll ask you in a few minutes to do more than just listen. We'll have more opportunity to hear from all of our panelists after these brief presentations. Next, let's jump back to South Africa, and I'm delighted to bring on Imam Dr. Abdul Rashied Omar. Imam Omar, there you go. Thank you very much for joining us.
Greetings of peace from Cape Town, South Africa. The current global COVID-19 pandemic has been a difficult and an exasperating time for everyone. But I am encouraged, as I hear from my colleagues as well, by the overwhelmingly positive and compassionate manner in which most religious leaders, religious institutions, and indeed ordinary believers have courageously and thoughtfully responded and dealt with these challenging times. So, for example, the majority of places of worship across the globe temporarily closed their doors in response to advice from public health officials to practice physical distancing in order to slow down the rate of the transmission of the coronavirus. So for the first time in recent history, the celebrated adhan, or the Muslim call to prayer, embraced a prophetic injunction which advises that in emergency conditions, the mu'adhin, or the caller to prayer should call on worshippers to perform their ritual prayers or salah at home. So it was surreal to hear the muazzin proclaim from mosques across the world in loudspeakers, "Sallu fi buyutikum, or sallu fi rihalikum," meaning pray in your homes. And what has been reassuring and heartening is the fact that the overwhelming majority of ordinary laity, ordinary folks, have responded to this novel call, as we have heard from Josh as well, in transforming their homes into sanctuaries and places of worship. People have been forced to pray in their homes, and this, as we have heard from my colleagues also, has led to a democratization or an empowerment, a spiritual empowerment of the laity, of ordinary folks who have developed a direct relationship with the transcendent being, unmediated by institutions such as mosques, churches, synagogues, or imams, or rabbis, or priests. This is a positive sign, and I think a clear indication that large sections of the masses are in fact responsive to changing circumstances, and that the laity and ordinary believers are not unwilling to adapt their religious practices to measure up to the new requirements of the times. Secondly, many religious leaders and institutions, as we've also heard previously, have rediscovered the powerful global pulpit of social media to broadcast sermons and inspirational messages. And others have been mobilizing to care for the vulnerable by organizing telephone calls to the elderly and the vulnerable. However, as we've also heard, the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic has also made manifest what we in peace studies call structural violence. The pandemic has deepened, and it has made visible for our eyes clearly to see the many inequalities and fault lines in our society, including those related to access to health, food security, and also internet access. There are millions upon millions who are not as fortunate as we are to be able to link up to a Zoom meeting such as this, and it's important for us to recognize that. In response to the pandemic, thousands of people have been left destitute and needy as a consequence of the loss of their jobs and income due to the lockdown policies. But religious organizations in the post have in fact responded wonderfully through charity. But I want to conclude with a challenge that was given to us by Pope Francis in his most recent encyclical called Fratelli Tutti, which means we are all brothers and sisters. And I want to conclude with this. Pope Francis offers in Fratelli Tutti a broader and a more comprehensive interpretation of the meaning of charity. And he proposes that, and I quote, "Charity, it is an act of charity to assist someone suffering, but it is also an act of charity, even if we do not know that person, to work, to transform, and to change the social situation that caused the suffering in the first place," unquote. I thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Imam Omar. And at the risk of stealing an extra 30 seconds from our panel, I appreciate the reference to Fratelli Tutti. The Interfaith Center is actually co-sponsoring another webinar tomorrow at noon Eastern Time, an interfaith dialogue around the Pope's recent encyclical. I'll put a link to that in the chat in just a moment. And apologies for the shameless plug. And then with that, let me bring on a good friend and a board member, actually, of the Interfaith Center of New York, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, Executive Vice President of the New York Board of Rabbis. Thanks for joining us, Joe.
Thank you so much, Henry. I hope the internet connection stays stable. I've had some issues here. Firstly, it was Pope John Paul II who said years ago that New York is the capital of the world. Who am I to argue with a Pope? So nice to be in a place that's referred to as the capital of the world. Secondly, I want to take a moment to say thank you to Reverend Chloe Breyer of the Interfaith Center of New York. During this crisis, it was Reverend Breyer who arranged for a memorial service at Lincoln Center so we could memorialize properly those who died of COVID from our respective communities. And I recognized at that moment that we were both interfaith and intrafaith. We were many, but we're also one. And I think one of the major messages of this entire Zoom phenomenon, because we've all become baby Zoomers, is that in life you have to learn to have a backup program. You know, interestingly, in the Jewish tradition, the Talmud, which is a commentary on the Bible, the Torah, begins on page 2. There is no page 1. And I think of that because very often in life, we have to learn how to begin on page 2 because page 1 has been taken away. And I think that's one of the major lessons of COVID. And I have to commend the clergy of all different faiths because I was looking at programs on Zoom for the different communities, how they responded to this crisis by bringing people together in their community. You know, when I first started as a rabbi, I remember I used to have an index card, a piece of paper with names of people who I hadn't seen in some time. Some were convalescing, others were facing other challenges, but it gave me a chance to call and say, thinking of you, how are you doing? And Zoom has enabled us in many cases to be more sensitive to those disconnected, to those who were not able to participate in a number of programs. So I'm very thankful for the technology. And, you know, there is an interesting phenomenon I find in religious tradition. Mountains play a prominent role. We Jews talk of Mount Sinai. We talk of Mount Ararat. There's also talk of a Sermon on the Mount. And a friend of mine said to me one day, why are mountains so important? Because in life, you have to learn to make mountains out of moments. And I think that's what Zoom has enabled us to do, that we have a service, we make a mountain out of it. We try to be as creative as possible. We try to connect as many people as possible. We have a ritual, for example, the sounding of the shofar. And in cases where we couldn't congregate on Zoom, people sounded the shofar. And it was a momentous occasion for many, that here they were isolated, but yet connected through technology. I think of people in hospitals that thankfully were able to communicate somehow with families, with clergy, because of FaceTime, because of, again, technology. So we really have to give a blessing that we were able to achieve Plan B and reach people who had not been, seen as being in the community, in the congregation. One of the challenges we have in the Jewish world is that we have traditional, more liberal, and people who are Orthodox won't use technology on the Sabbath. So that means that earlier Friday, some were having services to begin the Sabbath, but once it was the Sabbath, no technology, so they had an earlier service. On the Sabbath, there was no technology. So we find that there were a number of people who were praying individually by themselves. They were not reachable through technology. And that was one of the real daunting situations as to how we try to reach people who were not connecting in that fashion. So people were having some services outside, socially distant from one another, sometimes in sanctuaries when that was permissible. But everyone tried to find a way so people would feel included. And finally, I want to say this to you, that when you go to Kennedy Airport, you find the different faith chapels. And when we go, we all walk into our respective chapels. But I think COVID has taught us that while we can travel on separate paths, there comes that time when we have to travel together to help one another. There are a host of issues that are impacting people's lives, as was mentioned: social justice, food insecurity. All of these things need to be addressed, not by one faith community, by all faith communities. So I hope we have more of these gatherings and realize that, yes, we are many, but because of COVID, we also recognize that we must come together as one. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Potasnik, and thank you to all of our panelists. You know, we're running a few minutes behind where we'd hoped to be, which is okay. But so I think I said earlier we were going to take like a 60-second, you know, jump around the room break, and I think maybe we'll forego that. But I'll just say that I'll give an open invitation to everyone in the audience. If you need 60 seconds to turn off your camera and stretch or jump and dance around your room, go for it. But I'd like to, for those of you who are not Zoom fatigued, I'd like to bring our panelists all back on. So if we could highlight the whole gang together. Thank you. And I'd also like to invite, if you're not jumping around the room or taking a stretch break, you know, everyone else in the Zoom meeting, we invite your questions in the chat. We're not going to have time, unfortunately, to bring people on screen to pose questions, but please, by all means, use the chat to submit questions for our panelists, and we'll try to bring those into the conversation. So while people are generating their questions, I want to start by asking the whole panel to reflect on one or two of the points that Josh raised in his opening remarks. I was really struck by, on the one hand, the power of online religious practice to reach larger groups of people. And Roshi, Enkyo, you talked about that in the Zendo's, dramatically expanding community for sitting meditation and for other events. But then, Josh also suggested that in some ways, maybe the online engagement could be shallower, or which is, a judgmental term, but let's work with that, at least for the moment, shallower or more spectatorial. People are watching a show rather than fully participating. So I wonder if the four of you have felt that tension in your own religious practice in your community. But then also looking forward, if that's a concern that, online religious life might be in some ways less engaging than in-person religious life, like how can you all and faith communities respond to that? What can we do to make religious practice online more deeply engaging for all the senses, and less spectatorial? Like, what are some strategies we can use to make online practice as fully engaging as in-person practice? Anyone want to take that up?
So,
Roshi,
look,
I see you're unmuted, so go for it.
The first thing that came to mind is that we're doing far more small group work. It used to be like we're all in the Zendo together, a teacher gives a talk, maybe you go into individual interview, but the physicality of things in terms of you're around other people. So what we've done is we've included a lot more small group work, such as we're going to do here later, like breakout groups of 3 and 4 and 5 people, and given kind of talk about some particular spiritual theme. And that is our first attempt to try to make that thing that happens when we're physically together happen online.
So smaller groups, it's the same, just as you said, it's just like we're trying to do today. There's a certain kind of engagement that we can't have all 70 of us together, but so we'll do smaller groups. Rabbi Potasnik, were you? Joe, I thought I heard you jumping in on that.
Yeah, Henry, I think pre-COVID, clergy, I know rabbis were also engaged in how do we make the service more interactive? Even when we were in a building, how do we avoid this idea of coming and just watching? Because we find that people do want participatory services. So when the technology is right, it allows people to interact that way. So I think it's very important. I wanted to mention something about technology earlier, and that is, we have a custom, for example, in Jewish tradition of having recitation of memorial prayer known as the Kaddish. And for the Kaddish, for that mourner's prayer, you need a quorum, you need 10 people. Now, when you have a crisis such as COVID, very often you can't find 10 people in one space. You can't have 10 people. But because of technology, people were able to connect. We got calls. Do you know when I can say Kaddish with a quorum at 6 o'clock? I'll be free. Is there a group having Kaddish? So one of the things we find is more connectivity through technology and more interaction and collaboration. I know that I can work with rabbis of different denominations in having a program where people can hear different approaches and interact with people of different approaches. So I think diversity in programming through technology is now becoming something that people will appreciate.
Thank you. And, thanks for the reminder that this whole question about how to have rituals be engaging and not just tutorial, that's an issue in person as well. That's an issue that faith communities have been wrestling with, long before the pandemic and Zoom practice. Dr. Hadebe, I think you're unmuted. You want to have something to add?
Yes, I just wanted to say that in our context, when we are talking about Zoom and access to the internet, it therefore ends up being that one can participate. It becomes a class issue because in many, many Zoom meetings, people, let's just wipe out majority of the people. It's not sustainable, because the costs of the data are so high that even in many meetings, people have to mute the video in order to preserve the data. So in our context, that becomes a class issue. It means that to be able to participate with technology, you need to have resources. And then it raises fundamental questions about access. Does Zoom and all this technology in a context where majority of people can't afford it, what issues emerge in terms of class and equality? And that's what we see. The richer churches have Zoom, they continue, but majority churches, it's unimaginable. So we're bringing in new questions.
Yeah, actually, let's pick that up because that's another one of the essential questions that I think Josh raised and that I think we really need to address today if we're looking towards the future. There is this profound digital divide, in online participation on class lines, as Dr. Hadebe said, but then also Josh pointed out before, for some older and younger people, young kids who just can't focus on Zoom, or older folks who are less comfortable with the technology. So in all of your communities, are there specific initiatives that you have been doing to try to overcome those divides, to make the online practice more accessible for people who might not be able to easily access the internet? Imam Omar, I wanted to go to you first because we didn't get to you on the last round.
I'm glad that we're bringing this issue up because I think it's very, very important that this, as I said, the pandemic has also hopefully opened our eyes to the huge inequalities in our world, both within countries and across the world. We can see the kind of scramble now for vaccines is another obscene way in which we are seeing what the real world is like. In Cape Town, the Cape Town Interfaith Initiative, I'm delighted to say have offered, if people don't have data, because data is very expensive in South Africa, and then we get sponsors and we try to provide data to people to participate in Zoom meetings and so on. That's one small way in which we try to mitigate this digital divide. But another way is also we need to work in small groups, but particularly outside in the open. I mean, the evidence is very clear that if you practice good social distancing, smaller groups, and you are outside in the open, the chances of infection is much less. And so we need to think that the entire earth, as we have in the Muslim tradition, is a place of worship. The whole earth is a masjid. And in terms of traditional religions, African traditional religions in South Africa, they've always used open spaces outside in the grass as a kind of way of worship. And so I think another way of thinking beyond kind of buildings is to have little small services, especially in the underclasses where people lack access to social media and the internet.
Yeah, Henry.
Yeah,
one
Joe.
of the things that I find very heartening is we have a number of larger congregations said we responsibility.
Joe, your audio is kind of breaking
who
up.
don't have the resources that we have. We have to adopt another congregation. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
There are larger congregations who have said we need to somehow adopt another congregation and make available to them the resources so they too can be part of the the technological community. So I find that very, very reassuring. Asking what more can we do for others? And I want
one would hope that could also happen across faith lines.
You're connected to someone else to build, for example, group, etc. Some will say we need to be present, physical presence. So that's where spacing now becomes, an alternative wherever possible, so we can meet.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. But your audio is tough right now. So let me ask Roshi Enkyo or Dr. Hadebe, any thoughts on the question of the digital divide and the kind of class issue? Or I guess Dr. Hadebe raised this at first. So Roshi, any way you're trying to deal with this in the Village Zendo?
Yes, well, the class issue, we are particularly concerned about, we have sanghas in prisons, Sing Sing prison and Rikers Island, and we're not able to go there now and sit with those folks. And so we've been pressuring pressuring the prison officials to give access to these guys so that they can participate in our meditation practices. So we have not been successful, but this is the beginning of that. And that's one particular area of class exclusion. Of course, we write letters and we try phone calls, but the phone calls should really be for the family because they're so limited. But that's as much as we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Roshi. I want to bring in some of the questions from the chat. And I should say, first of all, there's been a fascinating conversation back and forth about the idea of a virtual minyan in Orthodox Jewish life, which Joe already addressed a little bit before, so I don't think we need to explore that in person, but everyone should take a look at the chat. There's great transnational dialogue about different definitions of a minyan. But then also there's a question from Cape Town. Someone asked, community has taken on a new look with the arrival of everything being online. What will that look like potentially? Well, let me try to, I'll translate from chat language. I think what this questioner is asking is, there's going to be an interesting moment when things shift back from online to in person, right? And people who maybe have felt very comfortable participating online may suddenly feel excluded once things are back in person, right? How are you going to, in your own congregations, in your faith communities, how are you going to manage that shift, God willing, like next fall after everyone's vaccinated, when in-person services start again? How do you transition back and bring along with you all the people who've joined the community through online practice?
That's a wonderful question. I mean, that we're working on that now, and it seems very clunky. We're saying, okay, you have a monitor when people come into the cloakroom so that they can do chit chat, because that's a huge part of our community, is when people come in and take off their shoes and they're interacting. And so far on Zoom, we've incorporated these kind of free times to do that kind of thing. And then how do you have a hybrid system where particularly not only people at a distance, but people who are not physically able? We have several people who are not physically able who participate now, and now we can't abandon them. How do we integrate them? So I don't say I have an answer. We are working on it. And it's typical, just what everyone would think: large screens, ability to participate from different places in the Zendo. So I'd be very curious to hear what others are doing.
Dr. Hadebe, Imam Omar, Rabbi Patastic, any thoughts on this? The transition back to in-person without losing what we've gained online?
I could address that. I think that, it's kind of...
I think we're seeing a real...
ambivalent. On the one hand, one of the good things for the Muslim community, especially in more kind of conservative South Asian communities where women are not allowed in the mosque, right? This has been wonderfully empowering for women to be able to be part of a service online. So there's a big benefit in that, especially for women. In fact, we've also, because we don't have a formal sermon, we have a kind of what you call Friday Nasiha, a message. We were then able to get women to get Friday messages, right? So there's been a wonderful kind of empowerment of women, especially in the Muslim community. I'm not sure how that resonates in other communities, whether it's online. The downside, however, the big downside is that even before COVID, when we, those folks who are floating in what I call cyberspace, right? We lose touch with community. So we, young people these days, they don't even know their neighbors. You ask, do you know your neighbors? And so that, I think, in post-apartheid South Africa, for example, one of the key things that we're struggling with is the vibrant civil society and anti-apartheid movement is gone. It's very difficult to get people to join anything. It's a culture of me, myself, and I, which unfortunately, the social media kind of lends itself towards. So there are some very good points about the social media, but also some downsides, and how do we kind of mediate that in the post-COVID era?
Thank you.
Henry?
A couple other comments on this? Joe, your audio Henry, was having trouble before.
You hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
I think there's a real dichotomy. One of the things that technology has taught us is that we can have shorter services because people don't have the endurance to be on Zoom for a long time. And nobody now complains that a service is too short. I think people appreciate the shorter service. But I think you're going to have that real divide where some people will say, look, I can stay at home. I can stay, in a more relaxed setting and listen. For the high holy days, for the major occasions, I'll come face to face, but I want both options. So I think that's what we're going to be looking at.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And we have just a minute or two left, but I see Josh Edelman has his hand raised, and it actually would be great. I was thinking earlier we should bring Josh back on to maybe respond briefly from his perspective in the UK to some of the issues that our panelists have raised.
Sure.
So we just have maybe 2-3 minutes before we then kind of shift to our small group dialogues, and I don't want to shortchange that. But Josh, go for it.
I'll try not to use all of that. There's so much to be said. I think the patterns that that I've heard about are some things that exist across the world, and we certainly see them in the UK. The question of the digital divide and digital poverty is a huge thing. And I think it's something that we need to think about at an international level, almost in the same way. And it feels rude to say this, but almost in the same manner that we think about access to clean water and adequate food, that there is a sense in which access to information is becoming, I almost want to say, a human right. It sounds, I'm not entirely sure I believe that, even as I say it, in that I think we need food and companionship and love and water to live and shelter. I'm not convinced Twitter is in that category, but there may be something there. I think we're starting to think about it that way. The other thing, what Imam Omar,
less access to Twitter in order
to
things. But Josh, I think the point is very well taken, because of the fact that this online connection has become, a central medium for human connection. So it's not just information, it's community and social connection.
Well, and that's what I wanted to say about something Imam Omar just said about community and the essential aspect of community. Somebody asked in chat, are we worried that buildings are going to go away? I think the impulse towards community is so basic to who we are as human beings. And religion, in all of its manifestations, has been one of the primary ways we express that. I don't think that's going away. But I think the challenge is online communities are communities. I keep getting reminded of this by my colleagues who are more au fait with the internet than I am, that you can form communities in ways other than being in the same room as one another, even if I'm too old myself to do that. I think there's a challenge, and historically, is the development of Zoom as something we all know and are comfortable with, if not love, is it going to be like the development of the printing press and what that meant for personal Bible reading and the whole launch of Protestantism? Or is it going to be more of the kind of what I think of as like the early 20th century rise of radio and kind of the show preaching of people like Amy Semple McPherson in America, where you had this development of a very kind of high performative spectatorial megachurch style of worship, which exists in other faiths. And I think it's too soon to say. Both of those are communities. They both had huge influences on what happened to community, but I don't know which one Zoom is going to be. Inevitably, it'll be neither. It'll be its own thing. But those are the kind of historical parallels that come to mind for me.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you to all of our faith panelists. Again, I'm so sorry that we are short on time. I have a million other questions on my mind, and there's a half a dozen interesting threads in the chat. But I want to turn things back over to Magdalene to bring us to the small group dialogues. And thank you again, Dr. Hadebe, Roshi O'Hara, Imam Omar, and Rabbi Potasnik. I really appreciate your insights today. And Magdalene.
Oh, thank you, Henry, and thank you to all our fantastic speakers. I hope that you enjoyed your conversations, that you enjoyed meeting people from different parts and from different backgrounds. So it gives me great pleasure now to pass over to the Reverend Barry Burr from Cape Town Interfaith Initiative. It's been a real pleasure working with Barry in preparing for this event, and we're looking forward to hearing her reflections. So if I can just ask that she be spotlighted. Wonderful. Over to you, Barry. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. My goodness, what an amazing experience this has been. And thank you so much, my colleagues in New York and in Glasgow. So it's actually the thread that has flowed for me through all of the commentary has been around relationship, our relationship with each other, our relationship with the earth, our relationship with the divine. And in Africa, we have this one word that speaks into relationship, and this word is Ubuntu. It means I am because you are, roughly translated. I am because you are. And Ubuntu is actually regarded as more about human relationship, but it's also about our relationship with the world around us. And I'm fascinated that the pandemic has shown us that it's also about our relationship with technology, with access to information, and with change. So listening to the panelists, Josh made me wonder if it's language that makes the difference. So Josh spoke about things being not very different, but then perceived as the same. So I'm not quite sure if consistency of language is one of the helpful things in helping us to cope and grow resilience within the structure of the pandemic. So I'm also thinking around the idea that seems to be coming through, that our relationships, in fact, hold our resilience, or speak into our resilience, or maybe we can actually even quantify our resilience through our relationships with other, and how those have changed and evolved. And of course, evolution and things changing is a very normal part of life, but my goodness, none of us expected quite the changes that we have seen. So as we have spoken about all of the questions around what the future of religion looks like, I made a couple of notes, and I really had more questions than answers. So one of the questions that I had was about the change in the nature of community and how we perceive that. But then I also started to wonder, as we were speaking about data, access to data being a class issue, I found myself wondering if that also speaks into our perception of something like the vaccine. So perhaps more, is it possible, is my question, that more access to data, more access to information makes us realize more how important the vaccine is? Perhaps it's because we in South Africa are a community of activists, and we've been trained into that for many generations now. But there is a large grassroots swell that looks at the conspiracy theories and goes, you know, Psalm 91 says that God is going to save me, and therefore I'm waiting for God to save me, and don't bring that vaccination near me. So how do we, as faith leaders with access to information, how do we take that information and compassionately and with understanding and with care spread that information to people who maybe don't have access to the information that we are fortunate to have, and maybe to present science as, for instance, and the medical profession as one of the gifts that God might use in order to bring us save us from this peril of the pandemic. So how we communicate with each other becomes absolutely fundamental to the entire process. And I'm just watching my time now. I'm also looking at the response to change and how we respond to change. And again, I wonder if it goes back to language, and as my dear colleague Imam Omar said, the global pulpit of social media has become something of a demigod in many people's lives, and maybe that is something that we really need to look at and question, and be mindful of the information that we put out there and that we spread. And that's why places like this, platforms like this, that enable us to really broaden our scope and really learn from each other are so important. And I do hope that the dialogue space really continues to blossom and grow, so that we can start to think together in a much more visceral way, which speaking about something being visceral seems a bit weird, doesn't it, when we're online? And I'm going to end with going right back to that quotation that Rose brought us right in the beginning when she said, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And I think that the pandemic then has been a call to action, and prayer for us, sacred practice, becomes physical action. So the act of planting a tree becomes a prayer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Berry. Thank you. And now I'll pass over to Rose, CEO of Interfaith Glasgow, to offer some final closing reflections.
Thank you, Magdalene, and thank you, Berry, for those wonderful, helpful and expansive reflections, as well as that call to action. And thank you to our wonderful panel of speakers, to our facilitators, and to all of you for your contributions to this fascinating conversation, which I know will go on in many settings for a long time to come. I hope that tonight has been an opportunity to learn and draw inspiration from each other, and that we'll take something away with us this evening. Before closing tonight's event, as in all previous events in this series, I'm going to ask that we pause briefly and spend a moment together in silence to reflect on what we've heard tonight, to let our minds quieten a little, and to help any ideas take root that might be helpful to us in the coming months. So Katie will put a candle on the screen now and make sure all our mics are muted, and we'll be silent for just 30 seconds. Thank you, Katie, and thank you once again to all of you for being here and contributing to this crucial conversation.